Introduce our next speaker. It is a privilege to introduce Dr. Sristi Kamal, the Senior Northwest Representative with Defenders of Wildlife, another colleague of mine who is doing wonderful work in Oregon. Sristi Kamal is from India and grew up in a biodiversity hotspot with elephants, rhinos, leopards, and tigers, which sparked a childhood and lifelong passion for wildlife. She has a PhD in ecology and a master's in environmental studies with focus on human dimensions of wildlife conservation. She has lived and worked in India, Poland, and the US. She currently works for Defenders of Wildlife in their Northwest office of the Field Conservation Program. In her current role, she works to protect imperiled and native species in Oregon and their habitats, including wolves. Sristi, I will go ahead and let you take it away. Feel free to screen share.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Rosie. And thank you all for being here today on a weekend, joining us for this conference. I really appreciate that. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Please let me know if it's not showing up at your end for some reason.
We can see it, Sristi.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes.
So hello everyone, as Rosie mentioned, my name is Sristi Kamal, and I'm the Senior Representative with Defenders of Wildlife. I am based out of Portland, Oregon, which is the traditional homes to several tribes, including Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Molalla, and many other tribes that called their homes along the river, that is the Columbia River. As part of Defenders, I focus on several imperiled and native species that are in our region, and I primarily focus in Oregon. And of course, wolves are one of our focal species here. So today I will talk about wolf management in Oregon and discuss some of the recent events, as you all have heard briefly throughout the presentations today, and basically talk about the path forward to where do we go from here. Because I think that's the key question to be asked for everyone. But before I do that, I will give a quick brief on wolf in Oregon, specifically wolf stats. So wolves are surveyed every winter in Oregon, simply because they're easier to find during winter. And there's an annual count. So at the end of 2020, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife counted at least 173 wolves in Oregon, which marks a 9.5% increase from 2019. It's a modest increase and definitely lower than the year before, where we had about 15% increase. We have 22 recorded packs of wolves, and they are distributed in 12 counties. We have 36 counties in the state. And 17 of those packs qualify as breeding pairs. And that's the parameter Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife uses to determine recovery of wolves, or the sustainability of a pack, if you will. In Oregon, packs are defined as 4 or more wolves traveling together in the winter. So that essentially counts a breeding pair and at least 2 yearlings that survived into the winter. So anything lesser than that is qualified as groups. And so you can see that we have 7 groups of 2 or 3 wolves at the end of 2020. If you look at population trends for wolves in Oregon, we see an increase. It's a modest increase, but it's a steady increase. So they are recovering, but at the same time, their number is still very low, and we definitely consider them to be still very much in recovery. There are other parameter that ODFNW uses is looking at packs and breeding pairs. And again, there has been a modest and steady increase in pack size and pack numbers. Breeding pairs tend to vary because it ends up being how many individuals were there in the pack to determine if they were a breeding pair or not, how successful they were reproductively. So that number tends to vary year to year. In terms of wolf monitoring, ODFNW has currently 47 radio-collared wolves, of which 21 were captured and collared during 2020 alone. This number again tends to be a little bit in flux because some collars just run out of battery, some just go offline. And then of course there are wolf mortalities too. Last year we had 31 confirmed wolf depredation of livestock. This number looks significantly higher than the years before, where we had about like 16 to 19, the max of depredation. But of these 31, 16 depredations were attributed to just one pack. That's the rogue pack. And that was kind of our problem child last year. If you eliminate the depredations from the rogue pack, the number of depredation has pretty much stayed same, even though the wolf population has been increasing in the state. So to correlate increasing wolves with increasing depredation is simply not true, and Oregon's data simply shows that. We had 9 wolf mortalities last year, of which 7 were human caused. And so I focused on the human caused ones here. We have 2 mortalities, one from a vehicle collision and one strangely from a boat collision. Never heard of that before, and here we are. There was one that was caught in the act, which basically means that a producer or a rancher can kill a wolf if he or she finds the wolf in active pursuit of livestock to attack or injure it. So that was how this particular wolf was killed. And that is legal according to the Oregon Wolf Plan. And we had 4 instances of poaching. This is a grim situation in Oregon, is increasingly becoming so for wolves. Again, for most of you, you're familiar with poaching as being one of those crimes that are very hard to identify, document, and report. So the fact that we have 4 means that it's an indication that maybe plenty more went unnoticed and undocumented. Because again, throughout the year, we're not counting wolves that were born. We are only counting them at the end of the year. And then we haven't had any wolf killings related to chronic depredation in the last 2.5 years. And that's why this year is so significant and important to talk about. For the last 2.5 years, ODFNW has not executed any lethal control on wolves. That is not the same as no requests coming in for lethal control. According to Oregon Wolf Plan, a rancher or producer can request for lethal control as soon as the wolves meet a chronic depredation standard. And I will talk more about what those standards are. But when a producer sends in a request, ODFNW then evaluates whether appropriate non-lethal tools were used. And that is in our wolf plan, that if you're going to issue a lethal permit, there has to be proof that at least a couple of non-lethal tools were used for a certain amount of time before you can say that, well, we tried everything and nothing has worked, and therefore we want a lethal control permit. So those permits have been coming in year after year, 10s of them. But every year, ODFNW has been able to look at those cases and assess that either not appropriate methods were used or not for long enough, and have been able to decline those. This year was different. And I'll talk more about that, of course. But looking at the location of the wolf packs, as you can see in Oregon, almost 70% or more of our wolves are in our northeastern part of the state. There was a discussion on BLM lands earlier, and most of our BLM land is in the southeast and a little bit in the northeast part as well. So, and as you can see, the southeast is practically vacant. There is no wolves there right now that are known. And the western part of the state has a few wolf packs and groups too, but they're very, very small in number. As the numbers of wolves grow, what we are hoping is more dispersal from eastern to western part of the state. There are, of course, habitat connectivity issues, highways, whatnots, that are of a huge hindrance to wolf dispersal and habitat connectivity for them. But this is where wolves are right now in Oregon. I mentioned the rogue pack earlier, being responsible for most of the depredations of last year. And you can see on the map there on the bottom left corner, so very much in southern Oregon. The 2 wolf pups that were killed that we've talked about came from the Lookout Mountain pack. So if you look at the map, it's at the right side, the bottommost name is the Lookout Mountain pack. So that's where the recent lethal permit was executed. Oregon's wolf management is determined by the Oregon Wolf Plan. And how does the plan work? The plan essentially divides the state into two management zones. The red line is the boundary of the two zones. So to the right is the East Management Zone, to the left is the West Management Zone. Now this line is different from the blue dotted line that you see on the map. That's the boundary of the federal listing of wolves. So until 2020, wolves on the left of the blue line were under federal protections, under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So the wolf management zone doesn't necessarily overlap with the federal listing of wolves in Oregon. And I'll give a little more details on that as well. So for each of those management zones, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife evaluates the phase of recovery for wolves. And we have three phases, essentially. Phase 1 applies until the population has reached a minimum of 4 breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. And that's where our western part of our state is. We are in phase 1 on the western side. Phase 2 occurs, it's kind of like an intermediate phase between 1 and 3. And phase 3 is when wolves have reached more than 7 breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. And that's where the eastern part of our state is. So the right of the line, a red line, is in phase 3. If you look at conservation and protection measures, phase 1 is the strongest one, and then phase 2 and phase 3 is the most lenient one. Let me move on. And so what has the federal delisting meant for Oregon? If you look at the right side of the line, of the blue dotted line, that particular area where actually most of our wolves are, they have been federally delisted back in 2011 as a part of the Northern Rockies Mountain Distinct Population or Segment, or DPS. That's kind of the part that was clumped together with Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho delisting back in 2011. So we never had federal protections there since 2011. Now with the recent delisting last year, the left of the blue dotted line also lost their protections. So what does that mean? Well, for example, in case of the rogue pack, as I mentioned last year, they had 16 instances of depredation. So they would have qualified for chronic depredation status and probably would have resulted in lethal control even last year. But because they were in the federally listed area, they were protected, and so they could not, ODFNW could not have issued because their management was under US Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's how they were saved last year. That is no longer the case anymore. So any sort of instance happening on the western side now will also be evaluated by ODFNW and can qualify for lethal control. There's also serious implication for the space between the red and the blue line, because they are in phase 3 according to Oregon Wolf Plan. So they have the least amount of protection. But up until last year, they had federal protections, and now they have moved from federal protections to the least amount of protection in one go. So that's also another implication for wolf populations that are in that area. So coming to lethal control, because that's the main issue here that we are going to discuss. Right off the bat, we'll say that lethal control is never a long-term solution, even when it's used in response to depredation. And we'll talk more about the science there. But lethal control is being used right now because wolves in Oregon do not have any regulatory protections. It is not protected under State Endangered Species Act, and it is not protected anymore under Federal Endangered Species Act. So the only guiding document in Oregon is the Wolf Plan. That's the only guideline we have in how wolves are going to be managed and protected in the state. The science on lethal control is clear that while if you're killing a wolf or a couple of wolves or X number of wolves from a pack, it might disrupt the pack and cause them to stop the behavior for a short amount of time, but it is not a long-term solution. It is not a way to get them away from depredation if that's what you're hoping to get. It's like putting a small Band-Aid on a large wound. Sure, you're covering it up for a second to prevent, I don't know, more injury, but it's not going to address the healing of the wound. You actually have to address that. So that's where we are right now as a state. We are using lethal control in response to depredation, and that's the controversial piece that we're dealing with right now in Oregon. The other huge impact of lethal control is that besides the moral implications and the fact that we're losing individuals from a very small population, is that who you remove from the pack has a significant impact on the pack dynamics. Most of you know that wolves are very, very socially driven individuals that adhere to very complex pack dynamics. They have a pack hierarchy that we are still understanding and haven't fully understood. So if you take an individual that's the lead hunter of the group, or if you take the key breeding female of the group, it's going to have serious implication on how the pack reacts after that. It could lead to pack disintegration. It could lead to more individual dispersers. It could lead to more conflict because the good hunter is gone. So we don't know what lethal control does. There's too many uncertainties around lethal control to say that it can be effective. So besides the moral argument, we also have a scientific argument against lethal control. I mentioned earlier about chronic depredation standards, and that is exactly the source of the problem we're dealing with in the state right now. The Oregon Wolf Plan, in its last revision, which came out in 2019, identifies two standards for chronic depredation. The phase 1 standard is 4 instances in 6 months. So there has to be 4 instances of depredation by a pack in 6 months to qualify for chronic depredation. In phase 2 and 3, it's 2 instances within 9 months. That's basically no standard at all. 2 instances of anything in 9 months is not chronic. You can have a cold twice in 9 months, and you wouldn't say you suffer from chronic cold. So this is just a poorly written policy, and this is what is driving the source of the problem we are addressing right now. So that brings me to what's happening right now in Oregon. So as I mentioned, we haven't had any lethal control in the last 2.5 years in Oregon, despite requests been coming in. So what happened now? Well, we had 2 instances here where there's one pack, the Lookout Mountain pack, that qualified for chronic depredation, and one group of wolves, that is OR 30 wolves, that qualified for chronic depredation by July. So our grazing season starts around spring until fall, and that's usually when most of the depredation happens. So by July, both of these groups and pack of wolves qualified for depredation because they were in phase 3, which is 2 in 9 months. So for the Lookout Mountain pack, they had 5 instances of depredation, 2 of which were injuries and not mortalities. And in 2020, this pack had 4 individuals. That includes the breeder pair, so the adult male and the female, and 2 subadults from last year. They were yearlings from last year, now they're subadults. That's what was recorded at the end of 2020. This year, they had 7 pups, so they were very successful in their breeding season, and that brings the pack number up to 11. So that's the total number of the pack size that was there before ODFNW executed the lethal permit. And as I mentioned, there are 2 subadults, and the breeding pair is collared. So this is important to remember because in the permit that ODFNW issued for lethal control, they allowed for the take of 4 wolves, but clearly stated that they cannot be collared wolves. So from that particular statement, they automatically eliminated the killing of the breeder pair. That was sort of a smart move from their end because at least the breeder pair being protected would mean the pups have a chance of surviving. If you eliminate the breeder pair, when there are 7 pups, the chances of 7 pups surviving without food source would be really, really tricky and probably would lead to starvation and death. So that's how the permit was written. And that permit was issued on July 29th and is valid till August 21st. And then for Oregon, the OR30 wolves, we had 3 instances of depredation, which included 5 sheep and 2 calves. This group of wolves has 3 wolves at the end of 2020. We don't know, or at least Defenders does not know, if there were pups born to this pack. But what we know is that there were 3 wolves by the end of 2020. That includes an adult male, a female, and their yearling from last year. In this particular case, ODFNW has issued a lethal permit for removing 1 wolf. And that is valid till August 31st. So as of right now, Oregon has 2 active lethal permits for these 2, 1 pack and 1 group of wolves, of which one of them has been partially executed. And that's the one we're going to talk more about now. So what went wrong? On July 29th, ODFNW issued a lethal control permit for producers and his quote-unquote agents to kill 4 uncollared wolves from the Lookout Mountain pack. So this was in response to a request that the producer had submitted after the chronic depredation standard was met, according to the Oregon Wolf Plan. ODFNW then did their evaluation, found adequate number of non-lethals being used and still leading to depredation, because of which they issued this permit. Now, when they issued this permit, as I mentioned, they have given this permit for 4 wolves, of which the breeder pack is eliminated. So the most you can take is either 4 pups or 2 of the subadults and 2 pups. When the permit says agents, that's defining the Oregon Wolf Plan that a producer can delegate his quote unquote agents to participate or help him execute the permit. And that could be your relative, your neighbor, someone from your community, whoever the producer identifies, basically. So this was issued on July 29th. On July 31st, ODFNW went out using a helicopter to find the subadults to kill them, but failed to find them. So then on August 1st, literally the next day, they went out again, and this time they killed 2 of the 3.5-month or 14 weeks old pups from that 7-pup litter. Now, literally 2 days after that, they issued another lethal control permit for the 1 wolf of the Oregon OR30 wolves. So within this week, we saw execution of 1 lethal permit, issue of another, and everything just blew up for us here. So what are we talking about here? What is the core issue here? Well, if you're talking at the big picture perspective on this, there is lack of consistency and clarity in when and how ODFNW engages in lethal controls themselves. So according to our Oregon Wolf Plan, if a producer requests them for help in executing their permit, ODFNW can assist them. But in the last 3 years, we have had 2 instances, and both of them in 2018, when lethal control permits were issued to a producer, but ODFNW did not engage in them, and that those permits eventually expired on their own without leading to an actual killing of a wolf. So even though permit was issued, it did not lead to the death of a wolf. In this situation, they reacted right away. The other thing is that did not go addressed also is the fact that ODFNW in the past has never killed pups unless it was the wipeout of an entire pack. So when they're wiping out or they're killing an entire pack, they kill every individual, including the pups. But in the past, when it has been permits for 1 or 2 wolves, it has mostly been yearlings or adults. And so this sudden shift and their justification that it is to cut the caloric needs of the pack is just unacceptable for us. And so that's the ground on which we are questioning them. If we look specifically for the Lookout Mountain pack, if we deep dive into what happened there, first, the permit was issued for 4 wolves. And if you don't count the 2 adults, that automatically meant that the permit targeted pups from the very beginning. Now, besides the quite obvious moral issue we all have with that, there is also no scientific evidence that directly links removing pups to decrease depredation. All the studies on wolf depredation and and pack size or removing individuals from packs have been mostly around adult and subadult wolves, simply because I am assuming those studies are going to be very inhumane to do. And so their justification simply has no basis on science. And the fact that they took the 3.5-month-old pups also does not make sense if they're looking for pack disruption, because these pups did not participate in the hunt. They are too young to participate in hunts. So if you're trying to break the behavior, these pups did not learn the behavior. If you're thinking it's a learned behavior that you're trying to break, then these are not the right targets for that. And lethal control itself is not the solution, but if you're thinking that lethal control is the solution, then even then this action does not make sense. So that's the other ground we had. The other issue was that ODFNW went out on day 3 and day 4 of the permit being issued. The permit is valid till August 21st. So they acted very fast and very aggressively on this. And this might be in their response of, we don't want any more depredation until August 21st, but the permit is for the rancher, and he and his agents has time to see if they can execute it. So ODFNW joining right at the very beginning and so fast and using expensive equipment was difficult to understand and justify from any front. The other issue is that they disrupted the rendezvous site. So pups at that age are usually left at rendezvous sites, which are sort of their daycare centers, if you will, where they leave their pups together and 1 or 2 manages or monitors them while the others go out to hunt. And they usually leave pups at their rendezvous sites, which they consider to be safe and secure. And they tend to go to the same rendezvous sites every year for that pack. You disrupted their rendezvous site through a very traumatic experience. So they will most likely not go back to their rendezvous site, and they're going to move their rendezvous site. And we have no idea if they'll move their rendezvous site even closer to a grazing allotment and create more depredation. So this is where lethal control becomes really uncertain. We don't know what the outcome of this action even is. Is it even going to increase more depredation at this point? So there is no reason to go and destroy a known location that the wolves consider to be safe and secure for them and their babies. And the last very big piece for us has been the lack of communication from ODFNW to the public, including us, which creates this sense of distrust and questioning their intent, because they're very efficient and prompt in communicating any livestock depredation on their website. Those are very easy to find. They post them very fast, very efficiently. As soon as the investigation is concluded, it's up there. The same goes for the lethal permit. Whenever a lethal permit is issued, they post it on their website. They give their justifications as to why they thought the lethal permit was valid to give. And then all of that information is out there for everyone. But in this particular instance, there was no communication from ODFNW that they had even participated in the execution of this permit. We found out through other media sources when they started reporting, and the only information we had was quotes from their communication person in those media articles. Even to this date, there is no update on their website of the fact that they have killed 2 pups or that they participated in the lethal control permit. So those are serious challenges that highlight how poorly written policy we have when we are talking about wolf management through one plan in the state, and that does not even address issues that actually define processes like lethal control. When there's so much opposition against lethal control, and yet we have it in the state, but even if we do have it, we don't even have a good process to outline how it can be executed. In Oregon, we don't have wolf hunting in any form so far. So far, our governor has come out against hunting of wolves in the state, which has been encouraging. But the only way you can remove wolves, therefore, is through lethal control. And the only way you can execute a lethal control is through chronic depredation. So as egregious as this act is for us from ODFNW, this is just highlighting how poor a wolf management plan we have in the state. So what do we do next? Well, the best way to look at it in terms of short-term action is that we do not want a repeat of the Lookout Mountain pack. So the long-term goal for that would be to have a better wolf management plan that improves the chronic depredation standards and that has more process justification in the plan on how and when ODFNW engages in lethal control. But in terms of the short-term needs that we have, there is a lack of clarity, as I mentioned, in how ODFNW engages. And that does not need to be fixed only through a wolf plan. That can be done now by ODFNW by publishing their justification every time they execute a lethal control. There has to be transparent and accountable communication from ODFNW to the public on any wolf killings that they engage in using public resources. And the last piece, which is also very critical, is to still prioritize non-lethal tools and deterrence instead of using public money for lethal control and have better standards on chronic depredation. So we are doing our part in engaging decision makers like the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission and the governor's office and the agency, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, to come out of this and to find a solution that does not lead to another set of pups being killed from some other pack. And as members of the public, for those of you who are from Oregon, it would be equally valuable for these decision makers to hear from you and why this particular instance was poorly executed and what could be done to avoid this in the future. So that's kind of a brief on what has happened. It's, like I said, it's still kind of live right now because those permits are still valid. ODFNW has not engaged further in the remainder of the lethal control permit for the Lookout Mountain pack. In case of the OR30 wolves, it has been clearly stated in the permit that they will not use any aerial means. So it has to be from the ground alone. So that at least means they're not going up on helicopters. But that's about all the information we have on this. And we are trying to work with the agency and decision makers to see what this sort of catastrophic event has created in terms of opportunity to improve wolf management in the state. So with that, I will conclude my part of the presentation. But I am open to any questions or any other details that folks would like on this.
Thank you so much, Sristi. There have been a lot of questions that have come in throughout the chat since this is a hot button issue right now. So thank you so much for giving that brief but awesome consensus of what's been happening. And some of these questions have actually been answered already from you just talking about it. So I'll start with one of them. I've seen a lot of public outrage about ODFNW's killing of the pups. How can Oregon's wolf plan be changed so that killing pups is not allowed in cases like this?
That's a really good question. And that's a question we have started to ask internally too. Like I said, there has not been a precedent before this where ODFNW has engaged in that. So maybe that's why it fell sort of through a loophole in not specifically listing no killing of pups when executing a lethal control. So that's something we will definitely consider as a key point to be included in the next revision of the wolf plan. In Oregon, the wolf plan is revised every 5 years, and it is generally through a stakeholder process where members of the conservation community also engages, including defenders. So that's one of the key issues we are trying to highlight and going to try and improve on during the plan's revision. But right now, if you're thinking from now until the wolf plan's revision itself, which is still a few years down the line, we still do not want this repeated ever. So for that, the best way forward is to actually work with the agency, explain to them what the grievances are and why there is no scientific backing and there is a huge moral question when you engage in killing of pups that haven't necessarily had a chance to try their luck at survival and thriving in Oregon. So that's the goal we are trying to achieve in terms of short term by engaging these decision makers and the agency.
Awesome, thank you so much. And kind of moving along with that question, has there been any it sounds like there hasn't been a lot of communication from ODF&W about the killing of these pups. It had to come through third party. Have you heard of why of the defense that ODF&W might put out for killing these pups?
Well, the public statement put out by their communications person was that this was done because their assumption was, or their assumption that with which they went forward is that because the pack size increased so dramatically with X number of pups, at that point it was 7 number of pups, because of the high caloric needs all of a sudden of a pack that has only 2 adults to hunt and 2 sub-adults to help them in the hunt, that's why they went for easier prey. So by decreasing the caloric needs of the pack, they can decrease the instances of depredation. There are many flaws in that argument, and we are definitely having those arguments with ODF&W, but that's the justification that they publicly gave. There was, of course, as I mentioned, they do not want the collared individuals taken, and that's because the breeding pair are the collared individuals in that pack. And to an extent, that makes sense because they are the mom and dads of the pups. And so killing them would almost essentially ensure all the pups will die. So saving them made sense. But instead of going for the sub-adults or even waiting to see whether this permit actually leads to a killing of a wolf, the fact that they actively engage to ensure that wolves are killed is the question we are raising. Why so hasty? Why so aggressive? Why so swift in reacting?
Is this normal for ODF&W to be so secretive and so fast in a situation like this?
That's a good question. I think looking at their track record, I would say that in terms of reporting on wolf deaths or anything related to wolf mortality, it has always been this way. And that's what we are hoping that this, as awful an event as this is going to create an opportunity to drive home that point for them, that every time a livestock mortality happens or anything happens to any animal because of wolf, you're very quick to report on that. You never report when a wolf itself is killed. You never do a good job ever of sharing that information. And this is what led to this. If you would have shared some information and we wouldn't have to wait for the media, we would have argued with you on the point of lethal control. But right now we are arguing with you because of the way you as an agency acted, which is a totally different story. So they have been not very fast in reacting in the past. Like I mentioned, in 2018, there were 2 permits. One was actually reissue of a permit. So there was one permit, it didn't lead to the death of any wolf. They had more depredation, so they reissued the permit again. Again, the producer didn't manage to actually find or kill a wolf, and so that permit expired too. In both of those instances, ODF&W had not engaged in actually going out themselves in trying to find and kill those wolves. This time, their justification is that the producers asked, and according to the wolf plan, ODF&W can support the producer if requested. That is true, according to the wolf plan, but to go out on day 3, instead of saying, hey, let's wait for a week or 2 and see, if not, then we'll see how we can assist you, could have been a path, but that did not happen. So there are questions in the pace and of unfolding this event that leaves us with a lot of questions. And again, a better communication may have given us more clarity, but we never got that. So we have only the press statements that their communications person made to news articles or newspapers locally and at the state level. So that's all we have.
Wow. Thank you so much for explaining that, Sristi. There's a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to walk through these. So what methods of non-lethal methods in response to predation would you see being the most effective in the areas where predation occurs? Are there any organizations actively working towards promoting non-lethal measures in those areas?
That's a really good question. And I'm not sure if that's from a member of the audience who may or may not have stayed during Zoe Hanley's presentation, but Zoe did touch briefly on the fact that there are several non-lethal tools and techniques out there right now. And efficacy of a tool or the adequacy of a tool is very much dependent on the landscape, the size of the allotment or pasture, the terrain, and seasonality even in some cases. So there's a lot of factors to be considered. So we have tools like fox lights, those are bright lights, and we have flaggery, but you cannot put flaggery over 35 miles of pasture. It has to be a smaller allotment. There are things in terms of practices themselves, like bunching of cattle at night or penning sheep at night so that they're not spread all across the allotment, where there's more chances and easier to monitor. There's night watch and range riding. So there are different tools, but all of them are very case by case dependent, which only highlights the fact that in our state, we have a lot of non-lethal tools around. We have not been able to pilot test the efficacy of any of these based on the diverse landscape that Oregon has. Eastern Oregon is dry, kind of desert, kind of arid landscape. Western Oregon is forest and rivers and dense vegetation landscape. So it's very different, but we have to be able to try and test which one works and which one doesn't. And it would make way more sense for the state to divert some of the money towards that rather than funding a helicopter that costs like $800 an hour to go up and shoot wolves.
Thank you. This is a really awesome question. What needs to be done to encourage ODFW to place age parameters on their lethal permits being issued? What do you feel is the most productive approach to getting this done?
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good question. I think this is where the question comes on how collaborative ODFW themselves wants to be on this. If you're looking for only what the rule or regulation says, then the only way we have is the Oregon Wolf Plan, because that would by definition then become the law to follow. But voluntarily, they can show proactively that they have the right intentions or the right process or the right scientific information at hand and voluntarily choose, even right now, not to execute or engage in killing of young individuals that less than, 7 months or something like that are incapable of participating in the hunt themselves. So if we are looking for something that's an absolute, the only route we have would be the Wolf Plan. If you're looking for an approach where we can proactively and collaboratively get there, then that is entirely on the agency to be willing to work collaboratively with us on determining those standards even right now.
Thank you, Sristi. Are the specifics of the lethal control permits, such as no aerial shooting on the OR30 wolves, made available to the public, and where can they find them?
That's a really good question. Yes. So as I mentioned, they are really good in finding in reporting of livestock deaths and in reporting of lethal control permits. And I'm sending this to Amanda if you can share it widely. But this is the page where ODFW posts updates of any nature related to livestock predations by wolves and then issue of lethal control permit. If you go to this webpage right now, you will see that the permit for OR30 is clearly written like it is for one wolf. Only you can only shoot it from ground or use traps that's certified by ODFW. And the producer had used X, Y, and Z non-lethals for X, Y, and Z amount of time. And that's why we feel it's valid that a lethal control can be issued. So all of those for the permit is always there. And we can always go back and question them. And that's a critique we can have of how ODFW evaluates a chronic depredation status. But that comes back to the policy of the wolf management plan. But right now, the way they're executing the permit and how they're participating is nowhere there. So that's what we are asking for. Why can we not have equal justification for when and how ODFW engages and justification for what tools they use to engage in it? So that's, I hope that answers your question, but that's exactly the information source we have too.
Thank you so much, Sristi. And if anyone didn't catch that, it's in the chat. Amanda put that resource in the chat that Sristi was just mentioning. I do want to, there's still a lot more questions. A really good one is, what can non-residents do to help protect wolves there?
I think just the fact of voicing out that everybody is watching and everybody cares is really important. I think, as the speaker before me very eloquently put, that wolves are on the chopping block across the nation at this time, with the federal delisting even more so. So all eyes are on states where they are very clearly exploiting that. Oregon so far has, been the golden child in not engaging in hunting of wolves, not killing wolves in response to chronic depredation for the last 2.5 years. And then we flipped a 180 on that this year. So we don't want to be equated with what Wisconsin is doing. We do not want to be equated with what Montana and Idaho is doing. So it's important for them to know that members of the public from wherever across the country are watching, and they know that it's a slippery slope once you start this, and that it's important to remain true to what your conservation goals are as a state, and stick by it, and not become another state that's not a good example of how to conserve wolves.
Definitely. Thank you, Sristi. So let your voice be heard with those action alerts. That is a great way to kind of help keep Oregon and these pups on the map. Is there concern of livestock owners misreporting in order to justify the reduction of wolf numbers?
Is there clarity on what misreporting is being asked here? Is it misreporting of
on depredations?
Okay. No, thankfully, that's where ODFNW does a really good job. We have very robust scientific process of investigation of carcasses. So if a livestock producer is saying that, oh, I found this injured calf here, you have to bring it in to an ODFNW biologist. And they have a very clear scientific process of looking at bite marks and where it's located and the size of the bite, the teeth size, all of those before they can conclude conclusively that it's wolves. So there are claims where ODFNW is called saying this is wolf, and then they look at it and they say it's not wolf, it's some other predator, but not wolf. So in terms of claims of depredation themselves, that can lead to chronic depredation, standard and lethal control is very robust. However, that is different from compensation. In case of compensation, you can make claims about my livestock went missing and it's in wolf area, so I'm pretty sure wolf ate it, so I need to be compensated. So that's a whole different set of problems we have as a state in how our compensation program is run. But in case of lethal control and lethal permit, there is a process of actually physically investigating, in most cases, the carcass itself.
Got it. Thank you so much, Sristi. Let me see. Do you feel that the rancher in this case made adequate use of non-lethal methods? ODFNW listed several methods that they had tried. What else should the rancher have used before ODFNW agreed to use a lethal permit?
We haven't been able to ground truth in that area because we are relying on a producer being willing to let us onto their property and being willing to show us what they have done or what would have been adequate. So it's hard to say for us right now whether the tools they used were adequate. The ones that ODFNW reported seems to be a pretty strong list of tools that could have been used. But again, without looking at the landscape or the terrain or the size, it's really hard to say whether that was all that could have been done or was there a scope for some more. So this is one of those cases where I really want to highlight the fact that non-lethal tools are meant to be there so that they can be proactive in deterring wolves. But the ultimate goal is for producers, or ultimate goal is to incentivize producers to change their grazing practices in ways that they are compatible with having a carnivore on the landscape. So for example, we have bred out the idea that cows bunch up when they are frightened or terrorized. Our cows are no longer used to doing that. They just walk around wherever. That was their natural instinct against a predator before. They would bunch up. And a big herd of cows is very difficult for a wolf to attack. An individual cow or a calf is much easier. So, but those kind of some natural instincts in some of those animals have been bred out. We need to bring those instincts back for them to actually have their own natural resiliency against having a carnivore on the landscape. They had those instincts naturally at the very beginning because there was predators on the landscape. Now we have no predators on the landscape. Those behaviors have slowly faded away. Those behaviors need to be relearned. And they have been tested in places like Montana, where some of the producers are working on bringing some of those grazing practices back and seeing how successful they are in figuring out, for example, calving season, making calving seasons overlap with their natural prey, such as elk, helps. Because if you already have calves on the landscape, natural prey that's available, you're not going to go for calves that are livestock. But if you have different calving seasons where your elk calves are already grown up, by the time your cattle produces their calves, and the grown-up elk are difficult to catch, so they'll go for the calves. So there are certain practices that needs to be brought back in how we practice animal husbandry and how grazing practices are managed in the state. So those are some conversations we are trying to have in the state with producers. But the non-lethals are a way to ensure that we get them to a state of tolerance to have that conversation.
Thank you, Sristi. Referencing Michael's presentation and those awesome statistics about people's reaction to having wolves on the landscape, has there been a similar survey done about the percentage of population that wants wolves protected in Oregon?
Yes, I'm forgetting the exact year when it was done, but not too long ago. I believe it's like maybe 2 or 3 years old. But it was over 70%, it was 73 or close to that of Oregonians who support having wolves in Oregon.
Wow, thank you. And then one last question. Thank you so much for all this information, Sristi. This has been amazing. This is from Marianne. Even though the wolves in Northeast Oregon didn't have federal protection before this January, might the federal delisting be leading ODFW to show less restraint in instituting lethal control than in the past 2.5 years?
That's a really good question. And that's a hard one to answer, as Marianne pointed out, because in these two instances, they're already in the delisted area, no matter what happens with the federal delisting from 2020. That said, as I mentioned, if we consider this as an indication of some sort of a setback in wolf recovery in our state, then we're talking about the whole state. What happens in our northeast corner will have impact for the rest of the state in terms of dispersal, how many individuals are available to disperse, in terms of forming new packs or pairs. So there is definitely consequence of that, and we want ODFW to be aware of that, even though that this is the federally delisted area, and therefore it's not the delisting that's leading you to do this, but it does reflect poorly for the overall state's recovery, and that it almost seems like because there is no federal listing, and we have only the Oregon Wolf Plan to dictate how wolves are managed, it's been really, 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 really tricky for us. And so I don't feel like there's a direct connection there. But that said, federal protections could help so much for Oregon, because that would protect 2/3 of our state. And so having the 2020 delisting reversed would be huge for a state where there is no state regulations whatsoever in terms of in terms of ESA. So that's how we feel about it, and that's how we are communicating to ODFW about it. But it's really hard to say whether the federal delisting itself has an impact, because it is in the delisted area already.
Thank you, Sristi. And I want to reiterate how much praise is coming in from the chat about your presentation, and thanking you for the work that you're doing. I want to give everyone a bio break before we get into our next three speakers. But just one last question that I wanted to ask you is, if there's no accountability to be had, is there a potential for a lawsuit down the road? Or is the best course of action through the wolf management plan?
I personally feel that the best course of action would be directly right now work with the agency to explain from our perspective and from the perspective of the public how things look. And like I said, for most cases, ODFNW had been receptive in the past to not agreeing with us, but at least willing to listen and work. A lawsuit might be a little bit difficult because unless we can bring some changes in the wolf plan, because legally, as unfortunate as it is, legally they have not done anything wrong. They have followed the wolf plan to the T. There, we did not identify pups as not something you can take through lethal control permit. And so if we go just by legal grounds, it might be a little bit difficult. It's not impossible, but instead of creating more animosity and hostility, the best way forward for the species in the state would be to find out a solution that can be worked out together, if possible, outside the court, you know?
Yeah. There is one last question. I apologize, and then I'll let y'all go for a quick bio break. This is the best way I've seen this question phrased. Given that only 4% of beef is produced from the Western public lands, is there any logic to getting cattle off the Western public lands where the wolves are to avoid conflict in high conflict areas? Instead of, having the wolves pay for it, maybe make there some compensation on both sides?
That's a really good question. And that's a question we raise continuously because, of course, that's an issue. Grazing on public lands and considerations for having carnivores on the same landscapes are not adequately addressed in any of our forest management plans for any of our big forests where grazing is allowed. That's something that we have been working on in the state in forest plan revisions for some of those forests where wolf habitat overlaps with livestock grazing. So that's definitely a conversation that's ongoing, will take time, but is happening. There is much to be done. There is always the ethical question of, wolves being on public lands and then preying on what appears on public lands for them, and how is that supposed to be not natural for them. So that's definitely there, but that's because we have made our grazing permits and our grazing processes very non-functional at this time. They're archaic at best, and they need to be revisited for sure. They are not written for a time when wolves were on our landscape. We have had wolves in Oregon since 2009. All of our forest plans are like from the 80s and 90s. So, there is a lot of considerations that need to be made for having wolves on our landscape now.
That is a great answer. Thank you so much, Sristi. And thank you so much for coming and presenting on Oregon wolves, especially in light of what's happened to these wolf pups. You've definitely given all of us some really wonderful information to work with on ways we can have our voices being heard, and a lot more information than what ODFNW has given us. So thank you so much, Sristi. At this time, I'd like to take a quick bio break from now until 3 o'clock, when we will be joined by Stephen Capra, the Executive Director of Footloose Montana, on an update about Montana wolves. On your screen, you'll see an action alert to contact ODFNW about what Sristi was just talking about, the 2 wolf pups. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but we'll meet you all back here at 3 p.m. Thanks, y'all.